They said my cabin was for sale. I hadn't listed it, hadn't spoken to a realtor, and definitely hadn't given anyone permission to step foot on my land. But the HOA didn't care. One morning, I found a realtor casually strolling the property, brochure in hand, acting as if my home already belonged to someone else. That was the moment I knew this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a power play. So I did the one thing they never expected. I locked them out. What happened next left the entire neighborhood talking. I bought the cabin for peace. That's what it represented to me. A small wooden retreat tucked away from the chaos of the city, surrounded by pine trees and quiet mornings where the loudest sound was a bird tapping against the window. I wasn't looking for luxury, and I wasn't looking for company. I wanted space, stillness, and the kind of solitude that's hard to find these days. At first, the cabin gave me exactly that. My days were simple. I worked remotely, brewed coffee on the deck while the sun rose, and spent evenings hiking the trails that cut through the forest behind my property. Every creak of the wood floors and every whiff of cedar in the air reminded me why I had chosen this place. It wasn't just a house, it was sanctuary. But sanctuaries, as I learned quickly, don't stay untouched forever. The cabin sat within a community governed by a homeowners association. When I first heard HOA, I shrugged. I assumed it was just a group that collected fees to fix potholes and keep the roads clear in the winter. It sounded harmless enough, like background noise in an otherwise quiet life. I signed the papers, paid the dues, and didn't think much of it. The neighbors seemed polite at first too. Waves from porches, quick hellos in the general store, the usual small-town politeness that doesn't go deeper than a smile. No one mentioned rules or restrictions, at least not at the beginning. And maybe that was part of the problem. I was lulled into believing that life here would remain as calm as the first season I spent there. That illusion cracked the moment I received my first letter from the HOA. A simple white envelope slipped under my door, its contents short and stiff. A reminder that my gate needed to remain unlocked during daytime hours for community access and inspections. The wording was polite, but the message was clear. I didn't own my peace as much as I thought. I remember standing on the porch, letter in hand, staring out at the forest and wondering why anyone would need community access to my cabin. No one lived past me. The dirt road ended at my property line. What could they possibly need to inspect? It felt unnecessary, maybe even laughable, but something in the tone of that letter made me uneasy. Still, I ignored it. The gate stayed locked. My mornings stayed quiet. And for a little while, I let myself believe that ignoring the HOA would make them ignore me. But the thing about control is that once someone gets a taste of it, they don't stop. The letters kept coming, more frequent, more insistent. The reminders turned into notices. The notices shifted into warnings. And even though the words grew sharper, what bothered me most wasn't what they said. It was what they implied, that my cabin, my retreat, wasn't entirely mine. That someone else believed they had a say in how I lived, how I protected my space. Even who could walk through my gate. Looking back, I realized that was the seed. The first hint that what I thought was a peaceful home was about to become a battleground. Because when people like that, people who thrive on rules, fines, and power plays, decide that your independence threatens their control, they don't let go. They tighten their grip. And when you resist, that's when the real war begins. The first few notices were easy to ignore. They sounded almost laughable. Your driveway gravel must meet community aesthetic standards. Your gate must remain open during daylight hours. Your outdoor lighting is unapproved. Each line read like it had been plucked from a rulebook designed to drain joy out of life. At first, I tossed the letters into a drawer and forgot about them. But ignoring the HOA didn't make them go away. It made them bolder. The tone shifted. What had once been polite reminders soon carried threats, fees, penalties, even mention of legal action. I remember standing at my mailbox with one of their letters trembling in my hand, my heart racing with disbelief as I read the phrase, "Non-compliance will result in escalating fines." The kicker? They didn't even specify what the fines were for. Sometimes it was the gate, other times the grass, and once, unbelievably, they claimed I hadn't filed the proper request to repaint my own porch. A porch I had simply cleaned and resealed, not repainted. It felt like they were inventing violations just to remind me who held the power. At first, I tried reasoning with myself. Maybe this was just a phase. Maybe the board had nothing better to do. Maybe if I stayed quiet, they'd move on. But deep down, I knew that wasn't how people like this operated. Because in HOA politics, silence is seen as surrender. And I was quickly becoming their favorite target. The harassment escalated in ways I hadn't expected. One afternoon, I came home to find a small orange slip taped to my front door. At first, I thought it was a delivery notice. Instead, it was an official warning from the HOA about unauthorized use of fencing. My fence, which had been there since the cabin was built decades ago, was now suddenly deemed non-compliant. The message was clear. They were digging. If they couldn't control me through simple rules, they'd look for loopholes buried in technicalities. Then came the unannounced inspections. I would catch people walking the perimeter of my property with clipboards, jotting down notes like they were surveying for a real estate listing. They never knocked. They never asked permission. They simply treated my cabin as if it belonged to them. Each time I saw them, fury burned hotter in my chest. This wasn't oversight. It was intrusion. I reported it, of course. I sent emails, made phone calls, even asked other neighbors if they were experiencing the same thing. The responses were always the same. Tight smiles, awkward pauses, a quick subject change. That's when it hit me. Most people weren't resisting because they were scared. They'd learned it was safer to comply than to fight back. But I wasn't built that way. The fines started stacking up next. At first it was $100 here, $200 there. Then the numbers grew larger, accompanied by threats that unpaid balances would become liens against my property. Imagine opening your mailbox to find an envelope stamped in red letters, warning you that the place you worked so hard to own could be taken from you over something as petty as the way your gate swung shut. Each notice felt like a punch in the gut. It wasn't just about the money, it was the principle. I hadn't done anything wrong. My cabin was well kept, my property was private, and I wasn't disturbing a soul. And yet, I was being painted as a problem, a rule breaker, someone who didn't fit in with the vision of the community. I started keeping every letter, every slip, every bogus fine in a thick manila folder, not because I knew what I would do with them, but because I had a feeling I'd need evidence someday. Something told me this wasn't going to end with paperwork. Then the whispers started. Neighbors who once waved at me now averted their eyes. At the general store, I caught fragments of conversations, my name spoken in hushed tones, followed by words like troublemaker or non-compliant. It was clear the HOA wasn't just targeting me with fines. They were poisoning my reputation too. One evening, I overheard two board members talking on the sidewalk outside the post office. They didn't notice me standing nearby in the shadows. One of them said, "If he won't play by the rules, maybe it's time he realizes this isn't the place for him." That single sentence sent a chill down my spine. This wasn't about compliance anymore. This was about removal. They didn't want me here. But the question was, how far were they willing to go? The answer came in the most shocking way possible. It was a crisp Saturday morning when I noticed something strange. A sleek black SUV pulled up to the gate of my property, followed by another car I didn't recognize. Out stepped a well-dressed man in a suit, holding a folder and wearing the kind of smile that didn't belong in the middle of the woods. Behind him, a couple trailed close, pointing toward the cabin like tourists. I watched from my porch, confusion quickly turning to rage as the man produced a key and casually attempted to open the lock on my gate. He was a realtor. The HOA hadn't just fined me, they hadn't just harassed me. They had actually listed my cabin as for sale, without my knowledge or consent. And this man was here to show it like it was up for grabs. My heart pounded in disbelief. I scrambled inside, grabbed the folder of letters I'd been keeping, and stared out the window as the realtor spoke animatedly to the couple, gesturing toward my home like it was already theirs. That was the moment I realized just how deep this war had become. They weren't trying to change me. They were trying to erase me. I wish I could say I calmly walked down to the gate and explained the mistake. But it wasn't a mistake. This was deliberate, a calculated move by people who thought their power was untouchable. And I knew in that instant, if I didn't fight back, I could actually lose everything. So I made a decision. The HOA wanted control? Fine. I'd give them a taste of defiance they wouldn't forget. That night, under the cover of darkness, I replaced the flimsy lock on my gate with a heavy-duty chain and padlock. I posted my own hand-painted sign on the fence. Private property, not for sale. Trespassers will be prosecuted. It was bold, it was risky, but it was also necessary. Because if they thought they could sell my cabin out from under me, they had another thing coming. The next morning, the same realtor returned, this time with different clients. The look on his face when he saw the chained gate and my sign was priceless. He pulled out his phone, made a few calls, and eventually drove away, red-faced and furious. But while I savored that small victory, I knew the battle was far from over. Because the HOA didn't like to be embarrassed, and I had just made them look powerless in front of outsiders. What they did next was beyond anything I could have imagined. If locking the gate and posting my own sign had been the first punch, then what came next was the knockout. But before that moment of vindication, the HOA tried one last time to crush me. The morning after the realtor stormed off, the letters escalated into something darker. This time, they weren't just threatening fines. They were threatening legal seizure. The paper I unfolded in my trembling hands claimed I had violated so many terms of the community that the association had grounds to begin foreclosure proceedings. Foreclosure on a cabin I had bought outright with no mortgage, no debt, and no connection to the HOA other than a monthly fee. I could feel the rage in my chest like a fire. This wasn't about rules anymore. It was theft, wrapped in bureaucracy. I drove straight to the next HOA board meeting, folder of letters under my arm, my heart pounding like a drum. The meetings were held in a bland community hall, fluorescent lights buzzing, rows of plastic chairs set out like a courtroom no one wanted to be in. The board sat at a long folding table at the front, smug in their positions of power. 5 people who acted as though they ran a kingdom instead of a quiet neighborhood. And at the center of them all was the president, a woman who wore her authority like armor, her expression permanently locked between a scowl and a smirk. When my turn came to speak, I didn't hold back. I laid the folder on the table with a heavy thud, spilling out months of bogus violations, harassment, and threats. My voice shook at first, but then grew stronger with every word as I read excerpts aloud. I demanded to know why strangers were allowed to walk my property, why a realtor had attempted to show my cabin as if it were theirs to sell, and how in the world they justified foreclosure on a home I owned outright. The room was silent. Neighbors shifted in their chairs. Some whispered. Others avoided eye contact. But the board? They didn't flinch. The president leaned back, folded her arms, and in the most dismissive tone I'd ever heard, said, "You agreed to the bylaws when you moved here. If you don't like them, perhaps this isn't the right community for you." The words dripped with arrogance. She wasn't denying what I'd said. She wasn't apologizing. She was daring me to challenge her power. And that's when I revealed my trump card. From the bottom of my folder, I pulled out the photos. Pictures I'd taken of the realtor at my gate. Clients in tow. Close-up shots of the for sale brochure he carried, with my cabin clearly listed. Evidence of trespassing, fraud, and misrepresentation. I held them up for everyone in the room to see. Gasps echoed through the hall. "You didn't just harass me," I said, my voice cutting through the silence. "You tried to sell my home without my permission. That's fraud, that's theft, and that's a lawsuit waiting to happen." The president's face flushed crimson. She tried to speak, but the murmurs of the crowd drowned her out. Neighbors who had once looked away were now staring at her, whispering in shock. One even stood and demanded an explanation. The board shifted uncomfortably, their fortress of power cracking under the weight of exposure. I didn't stop there. I laid out every letter, every fine, every false violation in a neat, damning pile. I announced that I had already spoken with a lawyer, that I was prepared to pursue charges of harassment, defamation, and fraudulent misrepresentation. And just to twist the knife, I reminded them that everything, every single piece of evidence was ready to be handed over to the local news if I so much as received one more threatening letter. For the first time, I saw fear in their eyes. The president tried to regain control, tapping her pen against the table, raising her voice to restore order. But it was too late. The crowd wasn't listening to her anymore. They were listening to me. And in that moment, the power shifted. Because what the HOA had counted on was my silence. They thought I would fold under the weight of their rules and their intimidation. They thought no one would believe me, that neighbors would see me as the problem. But now, with undeniable proof laid out for everyone to see, the illusion cracked wide open. I had dragged their corruption into the light. But the battle wasn't over. As the meeting descended into chaos, one of the board members, red-faced and trembling, blurted out a defense that only made things worse. He admitted the board had authorized the realtor's walkthrough because they believed my cabin might be better managed under different ownership. His words rang out like a confession of conspiracy. The room erupted. Neighbors shouted. Some demanded resignations. Others stormed out in disgust. The president banged her gavel, her voice breaking as she called for order. But the damage was irreversible. The very people she claimed to represent now saw her for what she was, a tyrant hiding behind paperwork. And me? I stood there, calm now, watching the empire crumble. Every ounce of frustration, every sleepless night spent worrying about fines or foreclosure, every moment of helplessness, it all dissolved into a single overwhelming feeling: vindication. By the time the meeting ended, the board had been publicly humiliated. They tried to maintain their authority, insisting that further review would be needed. but everyone knew it was a hollow attempt to save face. I walked out of that hall with my head high, folder of evidence clutched in my hand. Behind me, I could hear the whispers of neighbors. This time, not against me, but against the board. The tide had turned, and as I stepped into the cool night air, I realized something important. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was about every homeowner who had ever felt bullied, intimidated, or robbed of their peace by an HOA drunk on power. I had exposed them, and they knew it. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't have predicted, was just how far the fallout would spread once the dust settled. Because what came next wouldn't just end their campaign against me. It would dismantle everything they thought they controlled. Walking out of that community hall, I could still hear the chaos echoing behind me. Voices overlapped, chairs scraped against the floor, and the president's desperate shouts for order dissolved into nothing. For the first time in months, I wasn't the one feeling cornered. They were. The power balance had shifted, and I could feel it in the cool night air pressing against my skin like freedom. But winning a public battle and securing real, lasting change were two different things. I knew better than to think the HOA would simply back down after one embarrassing night. People who thrive on control don't surrender easily. They regroup, reframe, and retaliate. So I prepared. The very next morning, I met with my attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense professional who listened intently as I laid out the folder of violations, fines, threats, and most importantly, the photographs of the realtor trespassing on my property. She didn't need long to see the case for what it was: harassment, abuse of authority, and attempted fraud. Her words cut through the haze of frustration that had clouded my thoughts for so long. "They've overstepped. You have every right to take them to court."